Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. Good to have you here, and it's good to be back. Today, we're talking about some instrument approaches. And what would you say if I told you that throughout your career, the one approach that you will probably fly the most often is actually one you were never taught in your instrument training? It's a little bit hard to believe, but what we're talking about today are visual approaches. And so often, visual approaches are kind of just overlooked in instrument flying. Yet, like I said, they are the most common type of approach you tend to do in a career. And, unless the weather is truly at minimums or something, typically, if it's VFR, you're going to be cleared for a visual approach. So we're going to talk about what visual approaches are. We're going to talk about the requirements that need to be met in order to receive a clearance and fly a visual approach. And then we're also going to talk about one other type of approach that is rarely mentioned, if ever, in training, but also rarely, if ever, flown. However, still a great approach for you to be familiar with. So let's dive in here to our visual approaches. We're going to be pulling up AIM 5-4-23. And in the AIM, it says here, visual approach. A visual approach is conducted on an IFR flight plan and authorizes a pilot to proceed visually and clear of clouds to the airport. The pilot must have either the airport or the preceding identified aircraft in sight. This approach must be authorized and controlled by the appropriate air traffic control facility. Reported weather at the airport must have a ceiling at or above 1,000 feet and visibility of 3 miles or greater. ATC may authorize this type of approach when it will be operationally beneficial. Visual approaches are an IFR procedure conducted under IFR. However, they are done in visual meteorological conditions. Cloud clearance requirements, We'll skip that part. Basically, it says that when conducting visual approaches, pilots are encouraged to use other available navigational aids to assist in positive lateral and vertical alignment with the runway. So that's a key point. First of all, you're going to be flying into a lot of airports that you are not familiar with, oftentimes with 2 or more parallel runways. It can be very easy if you're relying strictly on your vision to mistake the runway you should be landing on, whether it's a left, right, or center. Some airports even have multiple, like 5 different parallel runways, and they go left, right, center, and then they actually just change the number. So like you had runway 7 left, 7 right, 7 center, and then 2 more that are still parallel that they just number 8 left and 8 right. So you could have multiple parallel runways. You want to make sure you're lined up with the correct one. So it is common practice and oftentimes required in the airlines and Part 135 operations to have a backup approach loaded and being monitored while doing a visual approach. So oftentimes just the ILS or something along those lines is going to be monitored while operating and flying a visual approach. All right. So what are the requirements? As it says here, the weather needs to be at least 1,000-foot ceilings and 3 statute miles visibility. So basically it needs to be VFR, okay? Marginal VFR, but VFR nonetheless. And then you as the pilot need one of 2 things in sight. You need to either have the airport in sight, or you need to have the preceding aircraft that you are going to be following in sight. Now, if the ATC center gives you a clearance to follow an aircraft that you don't have in sight, then basically ATC is going to remain responsible for the separation of you and that aircraft. However, if you report having that preceding aircraft in sight, then it falls to you ultimately to maintain visual separation with that aircraft and follow them in. Let's see here. Got a couple other notes. So it talks about how visual approaches, they are conducted under IFR. They are an IFR procedure, but they are not an actual instrument approach procedure. And as a result, they don't have any published missed approach directions, right? So depending on different situations, there's a couple ways you might go about it. Basically, if you're at an uncontrolled, untowered airport and you do the visual and you have to go around, it's up to you to either maneuver in a way to basically fly the pattern, come back and land, or maintain, of course, visual separation with other aircraft and obstructions. Call ATC back up, tell them that you had to go around and get further instructions and clearances from them. But if you're at a towered airport, generally the tower will give you instructions and probably hand you back off to approach or center in order to receive further sequencing back around to the airport. All right. So visual approaches, just the things to take away from it. They should typically be backed up with an actual instrument approach procedure. That's always best practice. So have the ILS loaded to the runway that you're doing the approach to. This avoids any confusion. Make sure that you are visually lining up with the correct runway. You must have either the airport or the preceding aircraft in sight that you're following. It's another note. It says here that a ATC will issue a clearance for the visual approach. If it's at a towered airport, they'll typically include the runway number that you're cleared for with that clearance. So cleared visual approach, runway 17, whatever it is. If there is no tower, or if the tower is closed at the airport you're going to, they'll just issue a clearance for the visual approach to the airport, because ultimately the runway is going to be up to you. Okay. So those are some things to keep in mind. The weather needs to be VFR minimum, okay, 1,000-foot ceilings, 3 statute miles visibility. You need to maintain clear of clouds when flying a visual approach. So you don't need to maintain VFR weather or cloud clearances, but you do need to maintain clear of clouds, okay? And I think that it covers most of it as far as the visual approach. But guys, ask yourself, have you talked about visual approaches? Do you know the requirements that need to be met in order to fly a visual approach? And then most importantly, I want you to ask yourself this: how competent, how proficient are you at actually flying a visual approach? When was the last time you went out, either by yourself or with a CFI, and actually flew a visual approach glide slope off of a visual approach slope indicator, like a PAPI, VASI, whatever? And how well can you maintain 2 red and 2 white lights all the way down that glide slope? Because that's essentially what needs to happen when you're flying a visual approach. We use the visual glide slope indicators rather than the instrument ones to fly those, and that's especially important at night and at any unfamiliar airport. So it's important that you are proficient in flying a visual approach, just as important as it is for you to be able to fly off the instruments. All right, next approach I wanted to talk about today is something some of you may have never even heard of, but it is the contact approach.
3, 2, 1, contact!
Now, contact approaches are not widely used, and they are even less widely taught. Like I said, I would not be surprised if the majority of you have not even heard or ever discussed contact approaches with your CFI. And if you have had a discussion with your CFI about it, it's probably been something to the tune of, yeah, contact approaches exist, but you should never do them, and end of story. But obviously they exist for a reason. So let's talk about, first of all, what a contact approach is and when might you use one. So a contact approach, the name derives from basically the fact that you need to maintain visual contact with the ground. Now, the reason why they're not typically used is because when you are cleared for a contact approach, it is basically up to you to ensure your own terrain and obstacle clearance, and sometimes in extremely low visibility. A contact approach essentially allows you to fly with 1 mile visibility and remain clear of clouds. Very similar to a special VFR clearance, okay? Now, the difference between a visual approach and a contact approach, or one main difference at least, is that ATC can issue you a visual approach. They cannot issue or even offer a contact approach to you. You have to be the one to first ask for that contact approach and initiate the conversation. Only then can ATC decide whether or not they are comfortable or able to give you that contact approach and any conditions that might apply to that clearance. So typically, it's not going to be a smart idea to do a contact approach unless you are intimately familiar with not only the airport that you're going to, but all of the surrounding terrain and physical features, because you might be literally following a highway that you just know if you follow this highway at this altitude, it will keep you clear of things and it'll take you straight to the airport. That might be the type of situation that you find yourself in, but unless you have intimate knowledge of that area in that airport, you're not going to know those things, and you're basically just taking a huge risk, rolling the dice. So this is basically only something that's going to happen at your home airport or ones you are regularly frequenting. And even then, it's not really the best idea all the time. So let's think about some times when maybe a contact approach would be useful and safe. So, we talk about special VFR. And of course, special VFR basically allows you to operate in much the same way a contact approach does. The only difference is a special VFR clearance does not require you to be on an instrument flight plan. It does not require you to have a flight plan filed, and it's limited in how far you can take it. Basically, though, it still allows you the 1 mile visibility and remaining clear of clouds. Now, contact approaches, they are an approach clearance. You have to be on an IFR flight plan, and you must request that approach. But ultimately, if you get cleared for it, it gives you the same limitations. You need to remain clear of clouds and have 1 mile visibility. So, the situation or scenario that I will often use for special VFR is actually kind of the same type of scenario that might be a good scenario for a contact approach. Let's say you are going to a Class Echo airport. Here in Oregon, we got a few of these on the coast. We have Astoria, we have Newport. These are airports that are Class Echo to the ground. Okay, so they are controlled airspace. They are controlled by Seattle Center. And being on the coast, it's not uncommon, even on the nicest of days, for that marine layer to be moving in from over the water and making essentially IFR conditions right over the field, even on a blue sky, bluebird day. So you could be flying along, and we talk about, with the special VFR, maybe you're flying VFR, you are flying towards the airport, it's blue skies, not a cloud in the sky, but you listen to the weather, and sure enough, it says that there's a broken layer at 900 feet right over the airport. Well, that's IFR conditions. You can't land VFR at an airport if it's IFR, right? At a controlled air or a airport in controlled airspace. That is IFR. So you get a little bit closer, and sure enough, you see these broken clouds that are just right over the airport at 900 feet, but you can see the airport right there. You could sneak under the clouds and go land. It's no big deal. It's a beautiful day. But you can't just do that. You'd have to get a clearance. So that's a perfect opportunity to call up Seattle Center, say, hey, we know it says it's broken at 900 here, but we have the airport in sight. We'd like to request a special VFR clearance. And usually it's not an issue. They let you do that, and you land, and you let them know you landed. So let's look at that in the context of a contact approach. If you were flying IFR on a nice, beautiful blue sky day, you could be getting close to the airport. Maybe you are being vectored for the approach or something, but regardless, as you're being vectored, and maybe you have, maybe it's been a long flight. Maybe that bathroom is really calling you. You don't want to have to be vectored all the way out and around to come back in on the approach. When as you're flying, you can see the airport right there. Yeah, you got the little broken layer, but you can see the airport. It's right there. And you don't want to have to go all the way around the long way. So what do? You say, hey, Seattle Center 65813, we have the airport in sight. We'd like to request a contact approach. Well, this keeps you on the IFR flight plan because remember, you can't just cancel. A lot of people would say, oh, just cancel IFR and go land. Well, you could, but then you'd have to still get the special VFR clearance to get in there, right? Because the field is IFR. So rather than cancel just to get a special VFR clearance, you stay on your IFR clearance, you request the contact approach, and then you make your way to the runway, okay? So it can be a time-saving measure, and that's a situation in which I would consider to be particularly safe and low risk, but it is a tool like any other, and just like with any tool, we need to know how to use it and when to use it, and having that in your tool bag certainly doesn't hurt. So, once again, contact approaches cannot be initiated or offered by ATC. You need to be the one to ask for it. They require you to maintain 1 mile visibility and remain clear of clouds. They are not used very often because they typically can be dangerous unless you are intimately familiar with the terrain and the area, which is why the scenario I gave is kind of a practical application of them. And they differ from the visual approaches, again, because ATC can offer you or issue you the visual approach. The visual approach actually requires VFR conditions, 3 miles visibility, 1,000 foot ceilings, yet you still can maintain clear clouds. But with the visual approach, you either need to have the airport or runway in sight or the preceding aircraft that you're following in sight, okay? So, guys, 2 approaches that I'm guessing not many of you have either heard of or certainly practiced. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Have you had conversations with your CFI-I about contact approaches, about visual approaches? How proficient are you in flying a visual approach? Let me know. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.